Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. I'm very pleased to welcome you back to our second webinar in our series called our Voter Education Webinar Series. We'll be holding an event every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Some weeks we'll even have an extra program. And if you'd like more info on upcoming events and a full schedule, go to securefreedom.org. Today's program is entitled The Rise of Anti-Semitism and the Progressive Assault on the West, moderated by my colleague David Wormser with guests Juliana Pilon and Joel Griffith. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will read those to the panelists at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as our website, securefreedom.org. And with that, I'll hand it over to our director on the project of global anti-Semitism and the U.S.-Israel relationship, David Wormser.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to have all of you here and join us in these unusual times. This is the latest in our webinar series. We're happy to get started again after the summer. We had one last week, and this week is the second, and we hope you enjoy them. At any rate, so today we're going to deal with anti-Semitism, and I think you're probably going to encounter some unusual views of how to understand it. We have three people with us today: myself, David Wormser. We have Juliana Pilon. Juliana is she has her PhD from the University of Chicago. She's also currently, I have to see this. Yes, you are a senior fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Foundation. That's wonderful. But I know Juliana very many years, and she's just one of those people who has good ideas about everything, really good ideas, and thinks originally, which is, I think, what we have to do right now, is think outside of the box, look back, try to find history, try to find ideas, the flow of ideas, and try to figure out where we are right now in all this, and the role of anti-Semitism that this plays in this new evolution. Following Juliana, we're going to have somebody who's probably more grounded in reality than I am, Joel Griffith, who has been following, and I commend everybody to read an article he wrote about a month ago on this new anti-Semitism and the role that Hollywood and others have played. So he wrote a very good article. He is actually a lawyer by trade. Juliana and I are more political philosophy and history, so we run the gamut of expertise here. Joel has a JD from Chapman University, the Fowler School of Law. I noted that he also was field director for the Republican Party in the presidential elections in 2012 in, of all places, Michigan. So perhaps in the future he'll come back to us and talk to us a bit about his experience there, given how important states like Michigan are shaping up for this round of elections. But at any rate, we're very pleased to have Joel with us as well. He's at the Heritage Foundation. He's a research fellow at the Roe Institute. So we're very pleased to have Joel with us as well. All right, so let me get started briefly with the topic. I want to sort of go back to two references here. First, a few weeks ago, sadly, one of my friends lost his father. And so I went on the web to see exactly what one says to my friend, a Jewish friend. What one says. I knew the basic phrase, but I wanted to get the Hebrew phrase right, the longer one. Those of you who've been to a Jewish funeral know there's a short one, both done emanate, but there's a longer one as well. And that I wanted to get that right. So I went on the web and I looked up mourning and Judaism. And what did I find? I found, first of all, the Chabad, the Orthodox website. And it was very interesting because what happened in the Orthodox website, there was a time continuum. They would refer to things 1,000 years ago, 50 years ago, 3,000 years ago. It was one continuum. And it was also geographically everywhere in the world. This rabbi from this town in Poland, which I've never heard of, this rabbi from Los Angeles, everywhere. The rabbis from ancient Israel, they were all present over all time, was there to support this one individual who had lost his father. It was as if everything, all time and all geography and space had collapsed to this one moment of support. And so prevalent was the presence of Judaism in this issue of mourning. Well, the second website I went to was the Tikkun website, which is a progressive Jewish movement. And it was quite different. First of all, you had the obligatory, when you raised the issue of mourning, it always was essentially a form of self-criticism. And you had the obligatory mourning over Palestinians killed by Israelis, mourning over the slaughter of Judaism by these nationalists and various forms of Judaism that are out of favor in their mind, and so forth. Ultimately, though, I was struck by how many articles and how much support there was being given to mourning over the foreskin for having been brutally cut off in circumcision. And so really, for them, mourning was all political, not personal. It wasn't bringing 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years of history down to a single point in time to support this individual in mourning. It was all about politics, and it was all about self-excoriation for Palestinians and foreskins. So let me leave that reference aside, because I'm going to come back to it. The next reference is Dostoevsky. So you had this movement in Europe, and I'm going to focus a bit more on the European side, being more American, and Juliana will focus on the American side more, being European. At any rate, the point is that Dostoevsky identified the rise of this nihilism that now we see on our streets in America. And he had a character in a book called the Devils, or Besti, a character named Verkhovensky, who spent the entire book seeking out the meaning of his life and realizing that at the end, if there was no God, if everything was destroyed in terms of some larger meaning to your existence, like religion or community, all you are reduced to is a series of interactions, chemical or otherwise, without meaning. So the only meaning you can acquire through that is suicide. It's the only act of will. The only real existence you can have is to terminate your existence, rather than just bumble along, going on through these chemical reactions and so forth. We saw another form of it in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, in the form of Bazarov, another character, also nihilist. You saw an evolution of this, though, later in France in this century, where one has to understand this nihilistic existence is also supremely narcissist, because it reduces the human down to just himself and his own quest for meaning. This is a conflict between narcissism and self-destruction. Narcissists can destroy themselves, but ultimately it runs against the grain of self-love, of being obsessed with oneself. And you saw a nice form of it evolve in France in the in this century, where ultimately you started seeing an expression that it's a self-negation through extreme self-excoriation. And Sartre was really the best example of this in his book, and he considered it one of his most critical books. Was a book called Semitism, Jews and Semites and Anti-Semites. And in it, he describes the Holocaust. He's certainly against the Nazis. It was written in 44, 45, right after the liberation of Paris. And he describes how anti-Semitism is the vehicle understanding the extreme evil of anti-Semitism, and is what gives him meaning. That the self-excoriation of European civilization through anti-Semitism is the ultimate way to overcome one's meaninglessness. What was interesting about this is it reduced Jews to just being an object of his narcissistic quest for meaning. It actually dehumanized the Jews. And he himself said Jews don't really exist. He wrote, the Jews don't really exist other than as a reaction to anti-Semitism. So Jews have no independent meaning in his mind. It's just an outcrop of European evil. So this is sort of where you come from with that. Clearly, when Jews decided they'd had enough of being the subject of European history and wanted to become, the object of European history and wanted to become their own agents, their own subjects, the ones who actually act, do things for themselves, this did not find favor with Sartre, and he was cold, very cold, to the very existence and rise of Israel. So you see among Europeans already this discomfort with Israel because it didn't fit the meaning of Israel in their mind. If this nihilism, which is very prevalent in European political thought, if this nihilism is really how you look at yourself, and Sartre and the rest of all the existentialist thinkers are all really how you think of intellectual life, Jews have to play a very specific role. And if they don't, they become a problem and they have to go over the divide into the self-excoriation side. But behind all this was also a destruction of history. Now, where do I go with this with the Jews? And this is the most uncomfortable part of all this. So even Jews have now absorbed this. We had a very interesting article recently by a guy named Peter Beinart in the New York Times, where he essentially said, I'm done with Israel. I'm done with Zionism. I'm done with a Jewish state with sovereignty being a Jewish state. At the cost of it, the morality of it is just so horrifying in his mind that it should be annihilated. He didn't say he was against the binational state, but he clearly, Israel as we know it does not exist anymore in his mind as a positive thing. So he acquires this view, and I think what you're seeing is, again, Jews, the Palestinian issue, what happened after, going back for a moment to Sartre, when the Jews didn't act according to the way the Jews were supposed to act and continue to be the willing victim, to be the perfect expression or foil for self-excoriation of European culture, the quest went elsewhere. And Frantz Fanon and others picked up on this. It went to Algeria and the colonial presence in Algeria. And from there, it broadened to an entire anti-colonial, basically third world romance at the expense or directly related to the self-excoriation of Europeans. And in this world, because the Jews had their own state and the Jews moved on, you got to the point where the Jews were on the wrong side of history here. Now, one theme of Judaism, unfortunately, is this constant quest over the last 200 years to finally navigate Judaism into the right side of the historical arc, the arc of history, this wonderful sort of determinist term, arc of history. And there's this deep desire to always move oneself into the arc of history among Jews, whether it was becoming the hyper-nationalists and then the hyper-secularists or the hyper-communists or whatever, that this was going to be the mechanism to put Jews in the right side and finally benefit from historical evolution rather than be run over by it. So too, I would look at progressive Judaism today, and I think it's a critical aspect of the new anti-Semitism is the rise of Semitic anti-Semites, the Jewish anti-Semites. Because if you are going to be nihilist and you want to utterly destroy Western civilization, this collective form of suicide, ultimately you run up against the core of Judeo-Christian culture. This is a nation that was founded on Christian values and Christian imagery and Christian understanding that Christianity is what made Rome in late antiquity survive and become great again and form European civilization. So to destroy the West, you really have to destroy its Christian core. But at the heart of the Christian core is also the Jewish core. So you have to destroy it. You have to go back to Mount Sinai. By the way, I mentioned Dostoevsky and Verkhovensky because he gives this brilliant speech inside the Devils about how nihilism works, this Verkhovensky character. He said essentially, one goes backwards through Mount Sinai. You start with the law and Mount Sinai. First, you undo the law, you make it inconsistent, and you make it not followed. At that point, anarchy begins to come. Lawlessness sets in. And with lawlessness will come blood. With blood comes chaos and poverty and misery. And at the end of it, the Jews will be wandering out of the desert back into Egypt, screaming for their Pharaoh, screaming to give up their freedom and go back to the Pharaoh. And this was the anarchists, which is the nihilism is the foundation of this anarchist point of view, which leads to communism and so forth. This was the anarchist creed. It's to go to Mount Sinai and reverse the entire process back into slavery. So to really destroy the West and lay it prostrate for this sort of a view, you have to go back to its Judeo-Christian origins. You have to destroy it. The problem is it's not politically correct to destroy Judaism or to destroy the Jews. That sort of was tried a half century ago, and it's still seen to be the ultimate expression of evil. So you need Jewish accomplices from the inside to destroy Judaism. Hence the rule of progressive Judaism. And progressive Jews, unfortunately, trying to maneuver and navigate into the direction of history to be the benefactors of it, are willing accomplices in this because they have taken Judaism. They're trying to extirpate from it the foundations, which is the subject of a longer discussion, maybe questions or so forth. But if you remove the pre-Roman exile history of Judaism, you essentially devastate Judaism. Judaism can't continue without the pre-Roman exile existence of ancient Israel. Neither can Christianity. The Bible is essential. If you remove all that and you reduce Judaism to what is essentially a secular religion, you essentially lay the groundwork for the destruction of Judaism. So it is really a mechanism through which one destroys Judaism from within. And I think this is one of the most dangerous aspects emerging in this new anti-Semitism, is the existence of Jews who are participating, some unwittingly, some may know more, may know better, but they're participating actually in the destruction of Jewish history to the point where there is no Judaism left. A nation of people without a history, which is what we're seeing with the United States, the attempt to destroy the United States. You take away people's history, you take away the bond that makes a nation, not a bunch of tribes, not a bunch of sectionalities or intersectionalities at each other's throat and fighting together. So by destroying one's history, the ideas behind the history, the culture that is built on that history, one destroys a nation and its ability to resist being destroyed. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing this rise in anti-Semitism, a form of pressure on the progressive Jews to play their part properly, which from within is taking down, looks to me like it's beginning to take down, trying to take down Judaism. I don't think it'll work, but that seems to me the effort. I'll leave it at that. Juliana, you have broad historical depth and knowledge, and I'm sure everything I said, not everything is something you agree with, but let's hear, you have an unbelievably rich view of this. We've discussed it earlier, and I think everybody will really enjoy hearing what you have to say.
Oh, thank you, Dave. I think I should leave it right there, right? Everything else would be anticlimactic. I mean, after that introduction. The only caveat that I would add to what you said, and it's not a disagreement, but rather perhaps a refinement in case it might be misunderstood. When you talk about the new progressivism being anti-Semitic, I don't know about new. That depends how you define that. But progressivism is at the core anti-Semitic if by progressivism we start with Marx. Because Marx took anti-Semitism and put it together with capitalism in a way that made it inseparable for progressives, making it extremely difficult for Jews to be both Marxists and Jews, and therefore so many of them chose to be Marxist first, Jews sort of maybe later, if at all. I'll take that with that prologue. I would like to redefine, perhaps, for us the concept of progressivism more generally. In a way, progressivism goes back avant la lettre. I mean, it's before the concept itself was so-called progressivism. It is ultimately an idea by various other names, you can call it Hegelianism, that history marches in an upward direction toward greater perfection. So progress is at the core of progressivism. And this greater perfection is achievable on earth. It is therefore clearly very closely connected with humanism and secularism, since after all, the idea that heaven can be achieved on earth is not something that a religious concept is necessarily consistent with. It can be, but much less likely. I really like, Dave, your image of the traditional concept that all of Judaism, all of the great rabbis are there at the moment of Kaddish, at the moment when death is remembered and dealt with, because it underscores the fact that history is not the be-all and all for Jews traditionally understood. So, if in fact the great perfection is achievable on earth, what does perfection mean? And in a post-French Revolution context, it means liberty, equality, fraternity, the three mantras. Now, liberty has increasingly been understood as the repudiation, whether radical or more gradual, of shackles on individual freedom. Freedom is another one of these words that deserves a book, but we'll leave it at that. And so then, what are shackles? There's, of course, caste and class. This is anti-tradition, anti-ruling class, and it is anti-conservative, anti-nativist, and so on. Clearly, that is the core of the fight of progressives against the reactionaries and so on. Property is a kind of shackle, certainly to those who don't have any or who don't have enough. It's part of what it means to become equal. But property is a shackle, and of course, in Marxism, the notion of class and property are inseparable. And finally, there is another important shackle, genetics. If you cannot do certain things because of your genetics, then if you're not intelligent enough or whatever, that needs to be fought. Whereupon comes progressivism in its early incarnation in this country. Here's where we had a progressive party or two, and another long story, but eugenics was at the core of the early progressive movement. Eugenics was clearly anti-Semitic insofar as it was also anti-everybody who is inferior, in order to create greater equality among who are left. Once you've got everybody pretty much, smart enough, you can then start engaging in what the progressives were all about, which is expertocracy. This is a new word. I just coined it, expertocracy. It's connected to many other similar words, but and then they can engage in redistributionism and all kinds of, for the public good, all kinds of measures. And then there's the fraternity aspect. Now, what do we do for fraternity? Well, fraternity, it's we're all in this together, right? It involves globalism, hence Wilson's Democracy Liberalis, and it's spreading the progressive mantra. Democracy is the way to go. Solidarity with the like-minded abroad, and of course, there's like-think. And there are the seeds of where progressivism has evolved today. The revolt against the ruling classes morphs into not just anti-capitalism and a self-hatred of the West, but specifically, and this rose in the 60s, anti-Americanism. And so the progressivism in America is in many ways the hub of the left today, although the intellectual center came from Europe. And I can get back to that in a minute. But I want to point out, I want to pick up on Dave's point about the self-hatred that was in Sartre. Even before it came to the United States. Herbert Marcuse did us a big favor in that regard. And the narcissism, the paradox here, both self-hatred and narcissism. And Louis Foyer, who in 1975 wrote a very, very influential book, Ideology and the Ideologist, he wrote, and it could have been written today, student and intellectual radicals, whether Jews or not, have historically had a penchant for self-hatred in the form of approval for anti-intellectual, there's another paradox for you, populism, and have defined wisdom as coming from the instincts of the masses, of the poor. Of course, the poor didn't know about it. It's the intellectuals who have to express it. That's very important. Lenin think, is intellectuals. No, the poor just, but we understand for their own good, always. Currently, such masochistic populism in the United States takes the form of identifying with the values, statements, and tactics of Black militant groups. That brings me to the last point that I'd like to make before we turn to Joel. And that has to do with the Black Lives Movement, because this is where we are today. The new progressivism in 2020 is a deeply anti-American, as Dave said, anti-American / anti-Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. And it is not merely racist, because it's, if you're Black, you're not yet saved. You're still in trouble. If you're, for example, Clarence Thomas, being even mentioned in the African American Museum is problematic. So it's not so much that it is anti-racist as it is anti-non-leftist. It is it becomes Maoist, and so it necessarily is also anti-Semitic, but not in the sense that all Jews are attacked. The Mark Zuckerberg, if they play footsies with you, at least for now, are okay. But anyone who puts any ideal beyond, above that which the current left considers to be mantra, to be perfection, the direction of history, is in deep trouble. And so we are today at a point with free speech that used to be considered a left-wing liberal ideal is out the window, and what the civil rights movement that during the 60s, which is when I came to this country from communist Romania, was more powerful, ended up winning over the radical Black liberation movement. It is now in retreat almost completely, not totally, but there's still the Nadine Strassens of this world and so on, but it's for the most part out of the picture. And Louis Farrakhan is back on vogue. And so the only thing that I want to end on the fact, and it's a fact, that the Black Lives Matter is deeply, deeply Marxist and definitely anti-Semitic in this peculiar sense, not that it's against all Jews, but against anyone and everyone who disagrees with the vision. And what is more, insofar as the Black Lives Matter organizations are intimately connected with the Palestinian rights movement, I'll call it, because it's the Palestinian rights movement. They have a shared vision that is ultimately inimical to the existence of the Jewish people. I will end there for now.
Juliana, thank you. This was wonderful, and we've really journeyed far in terms of ideas and history and everything. So, Joel, bring us back to earth a bit and discuss for us exactly how you're seeing it on the ground, how this is evolving now, and so forth. So I turn it over to you, Joel, and thank you for being here too.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your remarks, Juliana, and a big thank you for Center for Security Policy for having me on today for this very important matter. This issue of anti-Semitism, the scourge that we see, unfortunately, it's not something that is just relegated to medieval times when Jews were rounded up and put into ghettos or had their synagogues destroyed or their books burned or were forced to convert. And it's not something that is relegated to last century when we saw a genocide through the Holocaust that left 6 million Jewish lives extinguished. This issue of hatred towards the Jewish people, which is exactly what anti-Semitism is something that is alive and well today, and not just overseas, but here in our own country. And what we're seeing here in the United States especially is that we often see anti-Semitism cloaked under this really veneer of academia or theology or social justice, which I know Juliana just touched upon. Something that happened that really illustrates this point happened in July with Nick Cannon. I think most of us are familiar with that. Nick Cannon is a well-known and well-loved entertainer, and he was on a podcast that was a fairly lengthy podcast, about an hour and a half long. And in that podcast, he referenced a number of anti-Semitic tropes, and apparently, according to him, did not even realize they were such. But let's go over just some of those tropes that he just rattled off, so offhandedly on a podcast. He talked about how that. Let's see. I don't want to misquote him here, but he talked about how quote, we are the same people that they want to be, end quote, referencing the Jewish people. In other words, his people are the Jewish people. This is something that we see time and time again, where now we see groups that are actually claiming to be the true Israelites, the true Jews. And by doing so, they're trying to actually disenfranchise those who actually are Jewish from their very heritage. Second of all, he referenced this notion that you find in an anti-Semitic book from years past called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book that laid out a series of conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the banks, about the Jews controlling the sovereigns, the Jews actually starting and profiting from the wars and controlling society, and there being 13 families that control the entire world. In his podcast, he actually referenced these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and did so in such an offhanded nature. Now, I'm not looking to spend my time just criticizing Nick Cannon. I think that what happened on that podcast was sadly just a symptom of something much deeper in society. And that's, people don't just come up with these ideas. They're just not born with these ideas. What we saw on a podcast from an entertainer that has a reach of millions of people, unfortunately, that's just a reflection of what many so-called academics and some religious leaders are actually teaching those people whom they influence. And this has gone on for decades. I know Louis Farrakhan was mentioned. Louis Farrakhan's a member of the Nation of Islam, not to be confused with Islam in general, but the Nation of Islam here in the United States. And for decades, that organization has peddled off books that have seeped their way into the broader culture and communities that really is just a modern rendition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And you can see now how this is influencing so many community leaders and entertainment figures that have been educated in that. Now, something that Nick Cannon said in his podcast is, quote, he is just articulating, quote, history given to me by my elders, end quote. Well, who are those elders? Well, those elders are actually a number of academics and religious leaders, and we need to recognize that. Merely censoring or shaming speech, perhaps that would cause less of that to get to our ears, but that doesn't get to the root of the problem. We really got to keep that in mind. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think all of us, whatever side of the aisle you're on, no matter what your vocation is, we recognize that if you're targeting somebody violently for the race or for being Jewish, that is anti-Semitism, or mocking somebody's physical characteristics, anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism goes deeper than that. And in the 21st century, especially in the United States, anti-Semitism is now cloaked in anti-Zionism, anti-Israel rhetoric. And I'm not talking about just criticizing the Israeli government. Every government in this country, no government is perfect. Some are less perfect than others. Criticizing government, of course, that is fair game. But what anti-Zionism is not criticizing the Israeli government per se, or a particular party in Israel, or a policy in Israel. Anti-Zionism is an outright denial of the right of the Jewish people to actually have a homeland of their own in that area in which they are historically connected to. And what you see are often that those that are opposed to the Jewish state will outright deny the Jewish connection to the land, which we know through archaeology, and we know through both religious texts and also secular texts, that we know that presence has gone back for more than 3,000 years. We know that for a fact. It's not debatable. But yet we see that there'll either be a denial of the connection to the land or the right of the Jewish people to have their own state there now. And often now we see this intersectionality extend to Israel issues, where you'll see so many of those that are opposed to Israel claim that Israel is just another colonial outpost of Western Europe, and that it just somehow appeared there in 1948. Or we see this dynamic of the oppressed class versus the oppressor class, where 70 years ago, when Jews started flocking back en masse to the land of Israel, the world recognized that, sure, this was just a few years after the Holocaust wiped out 6 million of them. We finally, or humanity, I should say, the West, came to grips with the evil that had been done in both recent years and in years past. And they were very much the oppressed people. Well, 75 years later, after the establishment, we see Israel as this oasis of prosperity and relative calm and democracy in this region of such turmoil, and some immediate neighbors that live in such poverty. And those that view everything through an oppressed versus the oppressor spectrum see that and at least articulate this idea that Israel's relative prosperity must come at the expense of someone else. Now, without a doubt, in some parts of the world, prosperity relative to one's neighbor can be through exploitation and oppression. But we know from 70 years of history now that Israel's prosperity has not come at the expense of her neighbors. It's come because they actually have engineered a system of a rule of law and respect for human rights and property rights that has allowed them to achieve beyond the wildest dreams of some of the earliest founders of Israel. So with that anti-Zionism, which is truly anti-Semitism, the one movement today that embodies that most is really the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement known as BDS, which targets Israeli businesses and Israeli people. And really what they're doing is just a modern rendition of the boycotts that we saw in Nazi Germany so many years ago, where we are seeing, instead of boycotting Jewish businesses located in Germany, now these individuals are calling for a global boycott of Jewish businesses and Jewish people living in the modern nation of Israel. And corporations are not immune to this either. If you look at what happened with Airbnb just this last Hanukkah and Christmas, they had made a decision to not allow Israeli residences in Judea and Samaria within the West Bank to advertise on Airbnb because that's disputed territory. And at the same time, they would advertise businesses located in other disputed regions across the globe, and regions that weren't just in dispute, but that were actually unlawfully occupied according to international law. That is a horrible double standard. We see businesses that are really cowtailing to that BDS. And on college campuses is really where you see this really boiling to the surface. I've worked freelance on a number of projects related to the BDS movement on college campuses. And it goes beyond just hate speech, which hate speech, yes, on public campuses, that's protected speech. It's gone beyond free speech. It has gone to the point now where you see these activists for BDS. They will block students from gathering. They will intrude upon events. They will harass individuals. And it's tolerated by universities. The students that are participating in that often are not punished either academically or criminally. And it's allowed to go on. And that's a shame to see that happening in the 21st century in the United States of America. So I know I've just got a few more minutes. I just want to say when it comes to countering this, we have to recognize the importance of, from an early age, removing ignorance. In an extreme sense, if you look overseas in Israel, in the Palestinian-controlled areas of the West Bank, you see kids from an early age that are taught to actually take up arms against their Jewish neighbors. We don't see that here in the United States, but what you see instead is an indoctrination of a different sort in high schools and in colleges, which fail to teach comparative religion, that fail to teach the actual history of the Jewish people, and that intersectionality that we've all referenced between anti-colonialism and Israel, where then people go through the education system looking at Israel as the embodiment of everything that they also despise across the West. So we need education. We need our religious leaders in the communities that are infected by this right now. Some of these religious leaders who have themselves spread this, they need to take it upon themselves to educate themselves and to recognize, and all these leaders to recognize the important influence that they have to those who are learning everything that they know about the world. They're learning sometimes from these community leaders. It's tremendous responsibility. It's tremendous opportunity. And until these leaders recognize that, this problem is going to continue to fester. And it's not just a threat to Jewish people such as myself. It's actually a toxin to those very communities that you see that hate spreading. It's making their quality of life miserable or less enjoyable as well. Thank you.
Joel, thanks. We're going to turn to questions in 1 minute. Just wanted to say quickly, Joel, you mentioned the issue of the anti-Zionism and the expropriation of history. It's very interesting that the left, which accuses everybody of expropriating cultural things, is actually deliberately expropriating Jewish history and destroying it. It's one thing to be supersessionist, where one believes that the religion evolved and the Jews didn't get the memo and therefore it moved on to say Christianity or Islam. It's another thing to go back and say the Jews were not the Jews, that the Jews never existed. The whole thing of the Bible is fake, and everything we understand in this claim that these white people sitting in Palestine or throughout Europe is that they are the descendants of that people. It is not only a historical destruction, sort of an historical annihilation. It takes the narrative of Christianity and ultimately the narrative originally of Islam and throws it in the trash. So I find this anti-Zionism to be quite insidious in this regard. The other area, which I mentioned the issue of the foreskin, I just wanted to return to that for a second, about this anti-circumcision movement or the foreskin reconstruction movement, which seems to be gaining steam in this progressive Jewish world. Why is this so important for Americans? Okay. I mentioned Mount Sinai, and the issue of Mount Sinai was taking the tribes and through a code of law unifying them to the first real nation, which is sort of the way the Constitution and the American people melt into one people. It's the melting pot. It's the idea of America melts us together. But there was another mountain, another 1,000 years, or not quite 1,000 years earlier, a few hundred years earlier. It was also important. It was Mount Moriah, and it was the place where Abraham was going to circumcise, or did circumcise, his son. And what was so important about that is, in Hebrew, that's called a brit, which means a compact, a pact, an alliance. It's an alliance between God and an individual to mark a person off as a creation of God. And therefore, the human life in that individual ultimately is not the captive and is not given his existence or rights from any other human. He is given those rights from God. Then you go zap forward 4,000 years to 1776, and you see the first words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. I know Joe Biden had a problem with that, remembering it, but nevertheless, you see right there, that's Mount Moriah. That God gave humans those rights. They cannot be taken away by other humans. That's the foundation of this whole evolution of thought we had from the Magna Carta through John Locke and Hume and Montesquieu and onward, all the way to our revolution. So if you destroy the history of the Jewish people, you take away that fundamental founding, the two mountains essentially. You take away Mount Sinai and you take away Mount Moriah, and without it, you don't have the West. So let me turn it over to questions. Adam, if you want to start with any questions anybody has, and then we'll go off, and then we'll wrap it up with some final comments.
Certainly. Can you discuss this surge in anti-Semitism specifically in terms of the 2020 presidential election and how an American voter should weigh this issue? For anyone.
Well, I can start, and then maybe Joel, because you've had more experience politically than I have. I'll just say one thing about the progressive Jews, and you see how it's playing out. So you had Ilhan Omar running in Minnesota, in a very tough race against an opponent who was black, quite far to the left, an immigrant originally. The carbon copy or the perfect profile of somebody the left should really love. Specifically with Ilhan Omar engaging in a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric. And there's no way she doesn't know what she's doing in this. You would imagine that progressive Jews would feel comfortable siding with her opponent, who checks all the boxes for progressives, but isn't Ilhan Omar, who's anti-Semitic. And when you look, if not now, J Street, all these progressive Jewish organizations weighed in and supported Ilhan Omar against this other black person who was by no means a conservative, by no means not progressive, just he wasn't self-destructive of Judaism. So that told me everything I needed to know about the role of progressive Jews and how much they really are now turning the corner into a self-destructive ideology. So, Joel, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
I think that it's important for those that are in leadership in either of the political parties to call out anti-Semitism when they see it. Don't coddle it. And as we talked about in this session here, oftentimes anti-Zionism is the modern manifestation of that, and we have seen wholesale expressions of the most virulent of anti-Zionism with numerous members of Congress, namely Representative Tlaib, who has been a supporter of the PDS movement, and Representative Omar, who infamously suggested that implied that Jews have a dual loyalty between the United States and Israel. This is a slur that goes back even before there was an establishment of the Jewish state. This happened in the Enlightenment era in France, of all places. And we saw her do this. And yet she happens to have a spot, last I checked, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So I don't care whether it's Republican or Democrat who is spreading anti-Semitic perspective or commentary. Sure, they have a freedom of speech, but we have a freedom of speech as well, and that goes for every member of Congress. So you use that freedom of speech and counter these anti-Semitic notions, and don't just condemn the remark, explain why it's wrong. That would go a long way.
Juliana, do you have anything to add? Or?
Very briefly, yes. I think it's fair to say that the Democrats are taking the Jewish vote for granted. And one of the reasons they don't really care if they're perceived as anti-Semitic, as some of their members are proud of being anti-Semitic, as has been noted. But I just wish that someone were to stand up. I would have liked to have at the Republican convention someone to get up, as did one of the black speakers, to say, don't take our vote for granted. And as long as Jews continue to pull the lever for Democrats at the rate of 80% of the Jewish vote, they will continue to be disregarded. The fact that the Republicans in general, not everyone, in general, the percentage of Republicans are far more sympathetic to the state of Israel than are not only Democrats, but Jews themselves, is symptomatic of a deep problem within the Jewish community. So the voting in November aside, 2020, I think, is a wake-up call to the Jewish community. What are we all about? Where are what are our principles? So that's my response.
Related to that, there's two related questions. So what do we do with Jewish friends whose leftism is off the charts, and the Jews on the left won't debate the issues? They have closed themselves off to acknowledging anti-Semitism.
I can probably address that a bit. I am Jewish, and I am personally conservative in my domestic and my politics overall. I'm conservative. I do have a number of friends who are on the left. I would say the majority of friends that I've made in Washington, D.C. over the past 10 years in the Jewish community do vote on the left. They align with that. But there is a growing recognition amongst my friend group that anti-Semitism is a growing problem in this country. And there is quite a bit of chagrin that some political leaders that are in Congress that happen to be Democrats continue to engage in this rhetoric and somehow made it through the primary process, having openly embraced some of these ideas. I think there's a growing recognition of that. Now, that doesn't mean that there'll be a wholesale shift from one party to another, because there are, just as each one of us, when we vote, we're voting about a variety of issues, whether economic issues, social issues, foreign policy, and then of course racial issues, or including anti-Semitism. But I think there is a growing awareness and a deepening concern with many of those that have traditionally voted on the left domestically, that this is a problem that has to be much better addressed.
Yeah, Joel, I think you really hit on something. we have to remember liberal Jews and progressive Jews are not always the same thing. I was at AIPAC 2 years ago. It was after some of the bad statements by Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And I remember how many there were liberal Jews who approached Pelosi who came to speak, Nancy Pelosi, and told her, listen, we're horrified here. You got to get on top of this. This is really bad. And these are hardcore Democratic donors. I think there's this growing feeling among Jewish liberals, not progressive Jewish liberals, that somehow Biden can hold the center. They're beginning to understand that what's on the table here isn't just Trump versus the left. It's internal to the Democratic Party. It's the old liberal core versus the progressive, self-destructive nihilist challenge, the revolutionary challenge. And they're essentially hoping against hope that the liberal core holds. And somehow they believe that if Biden gets elected, he will use the power of the office to suppress and finally put down this insurrection, which the liberal Jews probably, if you have, other than about 25% of the Jews are either liberal or conservative. They're not progressive. You could see a major shift if that doesn't happen. What's important here, though, is they're still hoping against hope. They didn't read the tea leaves with Nancy Pelosi in Congress. One probably cannot call Nancy Pelosi an anti-Semite. Her father was really somebody who probably should get a prize from the state of Israel for what he did for the Jews and establishment of Israel in 1948. I'm sure she doesn't fall far from the tree in terms of her true sentiments. But she was so weak, she couldn't anymore. She didn't put pro-Israeli votes to the vote in Congress because she was afraid of exposing the fact that there were 50, 60, whatever number of Democrats who were progressive and had turned the corner to this revolutionary mindset, which is growing. So I think what you're seeing in the Democratic Party is an increasing fear of exposing the left's control of the Democratic Party emerging. And too many of the Jews right now, at least in this round, are still hoping against hope that the center can hold. But I think what that shows you is we could be in front of a dam bursting in the Jewish community.
Yeah, let's go to the I can pass. Dave is right, and Joel, yes.
There's several questions about new sources of violent attacks. For example, BLM, Antifa, and Black Israelites, and the examples, synagogue attack in Los Angeles, a lot of them in New York, and the violent attack on the New Jersey institutions. Just discuss however you'd like.
Okay. Juliana, you want to pick up first, or?
Well, in this context, it occurred to me that it would be useful to mention the fact that Michael Lerner, Rabbi Lerner, who you mentioned Tikkun, he is basically the founder of Tikkun. He is a rabbi there. He noticed back in the 60s that he was very upset that many of the Jews on the left, the Students for Democratic Society and so forth, were quiet when radical Black leaders like Stokely Carmichael, for example, and others said anti-Semitic things. And he was upset. He said, what's wrong with you? Jews have to stand up. This is just not okay. We are their best friends, which is absolutely, I mean, I knew friends of mine were devoted to the civil rights movement. And then he said, but actually I saw that indeed, that when the Jews objected to me that, look, we are afraid because there are threats against us. Michael Lerner said, and you know what? I found that they were right. So the violence, anti-Semitic violence, goes way back within. I'm talking about within the movement, the progressive movement itself. And so now to what we have today is, of course, additional hate mongers who ride on this horse, and violence is just bound to happen. I mean, whenever you cancel speech, violence is around the corner, if that far.
That's right. When they're burning Bibles in Portland, sooner or later they're going to burn the people who were devoted to the Bible.
Absolutely.
Joel, do you want a final thought? And then I'll say one or two administrative things, and then we'll wrap it up.
I think it shows that it's incumbent on those that are engaged in the political system, including those that are engaged in far to the left. And I would say far to the left includes some of the would-be economic revolutionaries that have been out in some of these protests that initially were BLM protests. Maybe you find yourself aligned on some of these policy objectives, but that doesn't mean that you should be turning a blind eye to violence, to rioting, and especially if you're Jewish, you should certainly not be turning a blind eye to the overt anti-Semitism, and sometimes it's violent anti-Semitism. And when you talk about some of the vandalism we've seen of some of these synagogues, it's time for them especially to speak out. The end does not justify the means. You should not remain quiet, even if you think that speaking out will result in you being expunged from your circle of activists. Silence is not right.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Juliana. This was amazing. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I want to invite everybody for our next week's webinar too. It is going to be hosted by Michael Waller, not Michael Lerner, but Michael Waller. And it will be, again, the same time, same bat channel, 1 o'clock next week, September 16th. And it will be on the American Voters Guide on National Security Issues. So we hope you can join you. It'll be fascinating, and we're very happy to have you on these weekly series. And we hope, again, we'll see you next week. And thank you very, very much.